to the Practical Prophetic, where prophetic ministry is made practical. I'm Beth Wingate, I'm your host, and welcome to the podcast. On our podcast today, we have an episode of prophetic history. It's been a while since we have done one of these episodes, so I'm really excited to bring you this story. But before I do, I want to touch on something. I personally believe in your spiritual DNA. Without getting too theological, there's a reward for believers called the Bema seat in your Bible that Paul talks about. And I've heard it preached before that until you get to heaven, the tally is not fully in for your reward. And so people that you have led to the Lord or have planted a seed in them, that starts a chain reaction. And the way God sort of showed it to me is that when I do things for the kingdom of God, especially when I invest myself for the kingdom into other people's ministry or into other people, it's like buying stock in a company. I'm invested in that person within the economy of the kingdom of heaven. And so we know that as companies grow and become successful, well, that can mean a multiplication of dividends off of that investment. Like we knew a man that had been born around the turn of the century, and he had some original shares from his grandparents of Coca-Cola stock. And by the time I think it had reached around, the late 90s, there was just no telling what his stock was worth at that point. It was worth millions. And so it's sort of like the same thing with the kingdom of God. And so this episode of Prophetic History really demonstrates that principle. I really believe you're going to enjoy today's episode. So let's go all the way back to 1835 in New York. So there's a girl who was born in New York in 1835, and her name is Sarah Dunn. She's born to a somewhat affluent family, and she's brought up in Sunday school like most people by Christian parents, and so she avoided a lot of social pitfalls that people would have during this time. Now remember, let's set the scene. This is pre-Civil War. So this is New York City. It's an immigrant city. It's bustling. It's sort of the epicenter of America's industrial booming economy at this time. So she actually wanted to become a Christian as she gets a little older, around her 20s. So this would have been around 1855. And but no one had really explained and laid out the plan of salvation. Churches were very liturgical at this time, and so that's not really surprising. She returned from a visit to a local seminary in Pennsylvania called the Wilkes-Barre Seminary, and an acquaintance that was with her at the train station said, "Have you given your heart to the Lord?" And so she said it was at that moment when her soul was flooded and she really fully gave her heart to the Lord around 20 years old. And so she went on to become a school teacher. And around age 30, she will move to Iowa, and then she will move on to Chicago. Now, she says that it was some time when she was back in New York, this would have been in her very early 30s, maybe even her late 20s, that she was helping to decorate her parents' home. And like I said, they were fairly well off. And she had become a Christian. But she said she really was a stranger to the concept of consecration. Oh, we could do a whole podcast on consecration. But I'm going to stick to her story. And so she said she was completing a very elaborate decoration for the family home. And she said it was during this moment. Now, here's our prophetic moment that she heard an audible voice, which she believes was the voice of the Lord. And man, did it change the whole course of her life. And it changed, you could argue today, it has an impact on about 3 billion people. Amazing. So let me go back and tell this story. So Sarah is at her parents' home in New York. She's around 30 years old. She's decorating very elaborate decorations, and she hears an audible voice. That, by definition, is prophetic. And so the voice says to her, and I'm just going to read here a quote. It said, What are you doing to decorate your heavenly home? And that was it. And she said she really had to ponder and think about that. I've read several different, accounts from her biography and stories about her and articles about her. And so she really began to ponder that question. What is she doing to decorate her heavenly home? And so that really set her on a course. So around 33 years old, while she's in Chicago, she will meet a man named Colonel George R. Clarke. Now, he's a prominent realtor, he's a lawyer, and a Civil War veteran. He had fought for the Union Army out of Chicago. He had actually gathered volunteers for the Union Army, and they made him a colonel over the group. And so he had been involved in the war, and so he's come home. The war has basically just ended. He's come back home, and they meet, and during this time, they begin relationship. They begin to date, and during this time, she sees a lot of poor families in the area. And so she and her friends decide to start a mission Sunday school. And actually, it was located in Chicago at State and 23rd Street. If you know Chicago, it's just right there in the heart of Chicago. And so her Sunday school group starts a little mission to begin to minister to these poor families. And you have to remember, post-Civil War, Chicago was inundated with people moving north, moving out of the South and all the chaos in the South and pushing into areas like Chicago, Detroit, New York. Places like that were just flooded with people fleeing from the South. And so it was during this time that she starts this mission. Now, in the middle of her doing this mission, and while she's dating what will become her husband, this Colonel Clarke, something amazing happens in Chicago. This really becomes a critical part of her story. So in 1871, Chicago will have what is called the Great Fire of Chicago. There was a small house right there on the outskirts of Chicago that catches fire. They believe that a cow knocked over a candle or a lantern, but it was windy and dry at that time of the year, and everything in Chicago is very dense. And so this fire breaks out. Now, think about a city like Chicago. And by the way, it has a huge river that runs right through it. And so this city will have about 3.3 square miles burned. And that is about 2,000 acres that will catch fire. 300 people approximately were killed. That's the ones that they can account for. They really believe the number is much higher than that. About 17,000 buildings are destroyed, and over 100,000 people were instantly homeless. Today, that would be about $222 million in property damage, which was about a third of the city's valuation in 1871. So it took out a third of the economy. It left about a third of the people homeless. It was devastation. This was a life-altering generational event for Chicagoans at this time, and it made national and international headlines. The fire, just because of the wind, it spread so quick that people couldn't put it out, and because the city was so dense and most structures were made out of wood at that time, things just went up quickly, and it was just a devastating fire. And so this will cause just a massive amount of people to be homeless. And then as a result of this, now you've got to think this is just post-Civil War, so you've got soldiers coming back home, you've got people fleeing the South, especially people who had just been set free from slavery, people who have escaped slavery, people who are war-torn, people who have lost their farms and they're coming into the city. And you have a convergence of all of this activity. Then you have the fire, and they said that alcoholism became a massive problem, that people were just depressed, they could not cope, and that it was a real plight in the city, and especially in the south side of Chicago. So right 2 years after the Great Fire of Chicago in 1873, Colonel Clarke and Sarah will marry. Now, Colonel Clarke, he's a worldly businessman, but he had a praying mother. I just want to stop right there and talk about the value of having someone at home praying for him. And it was around this time, though, that he did come to the Lord. But now he's still pretty worldly. He's running around an upper crust group of people. He's a prominent colonel. He's a lawyer. He's a real estate investor. He's a very successful businessman. And they're running around with the upper crust crowd in Chicago. And so they're going to dinner parties and things like this all the time. But he tells a separate story about how that on a business trip had an overwhelming sense to get his life right with the Lord. Of course, I'm sure he knows that Sarah is a devout Christian at this time, and I'm sure that was on his mind also. But God had been speaking to Sarah and had warned her about the time she wasted at social functions, that he was really pursuing society basically at that time. And she had persuaded her husband to become a Christian, He actually had his own encounter with the Lord, really because of his praying mother. He's on a business trip thousands of miles away, and he actually ends up sending a telegram to her to let her know that he had got things right with the Lord and that he wanted to live a devoted life unto the Lord. So Sarah convinces him to visit the city slums, and that she really had this conviction that they were supposed to minister to these people. And so he decided that that's what they needed to do. He was fully on board. And so after the fire, churches had pushed out to the outskirts of the city, and where the churches had pretty much left inside the city was just saloons, brothels, gambling halls. Basically, in Chicago, you have what's called the Loop. And so the churches had mostly pushed out beyond the Loop, and all of the riffraff, if you will, had stayed inside the Loop. And so Colonel Clarke and Sarah, they decide in 1877 that they're going to start a mission, that they're going to do something. I mean, they basically offered people a hot meal. They did music, mostly hymns. They would basically, he was not an eloquent preacher. In fact, a lot of articles go out of their way to tell you how much of not an eloquent speaker that he was. But he had his testimony. And so he would just share his testimony, and then he would have people share their testimonies, and they would give people usually a bed to sleep on. And so Chicago, you got to remember too, is really cold, especially in the winter. And it's also called the Windy City. In fact, just to give you an idea of how windy it is, we went there one time on a trip, and we went out to Navy Pier, which is out on the Great Lakes, and it kind of jets out on this little peninsula, and they have a lot of restaurants and like a museum. It's a really neat place. And out at the end, there was a lady walking her dog, and it wasn't a real big dog, but it wasn't super tiny either. It was maybe a 10, 12-pound dog, medium, little dog. And the dog was on a leash, and the wind was so strong that you had to kind of lean forward to just walk into the wind, and she was holding the leash, and it swept the dog off its feet. And so she had to reel the poor dog in on the leash and hold it, because the wind actually kicked the dog's legs out from under it and was going to carry the dog away. And so we just remember thinking, oh my goodness, So it really is the Windy City, and it really is amazingly cold. And when the wind blows and it's cold like that in Chicago, it is piercing. This is the only word I can think of. It was just so cold. And so I can't imagine the difficult situations that people who were homeless, especially at this time, would be in. And so they started this mission. And first it was out of a little storefront. In fact, it was at 386 South Clark Street. And all they had was a little potbelly stove. They had some kerosene lamps for lighting, and they had written some Bible verses on the walls. And they had a room to maybe seat 40 people, packed in there like sardines. So it was a really small room. And of course, they filled it up. Today, it probably wouldn't make fire code. They probably had people in there just on top of each other practically. I'm sure they had built bunk beds or something, but the people were piled in there like cordwood, basically. And so they outgrew it very, very quickly. Now, just to give you an idea how groundbreaking this was, only 5 years earlier, the world's first rescue mission had been founded in New York City in 1872 by a man named Jerry McAuley. This was a new concept, a new idea. Now, you got to go back to history to really understand this. In England and Ireland, they had a thing called the poorhouse that the government typically established where you would work in exchange for basically a room and a meal, a cot and a hot is what they called it. And so you had to work really hard labor in a factory typically in order to do that. And that was sort of government mandated. But for a church to do something like this, or a Christian mission, this was groundbreaking. This was a brand new idea in society. And so this was only the second type of mission like this on a large scale where they actually offered you a bed, not just a meal, but a place to sleep, and they would do preaching and music like a church service, and then give you food and a place to stay. And this was all supported by local churches and basically just through charity. And I'm sure, the Clarks were a fairly well-to-do family. I'm sure at the beginning they funded a lot of this themselves. In fact, it is during this time that he will abandon and sell off all his possessions, and they will basically live right there by the mission. And she would stop in, they said, 3 times a day, overseeing, as people came in and would come and get converted through the mission, then they would put them to work. In fact, out of this mission, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, there are some people who come through here, they get converted, and they go on to have their own large-scale ministries. Many of them. I'm only going to really focus on a couple of them. And so there was recorded in a journal that on the very first day, 4 people professed conversion and gave their testimony. So the way they would do this is you would come in, and they would have music, hymns. They had a little piano there, and they would do a church service. And basically, it was all centered around testimony and the plan of salvation. And so when you were converted, then the next week, you would share your testimony. So that's pretty much how the services were formatted. And so after 5 years in 1882, they decided that they needed to move to a bigger building. And so they wanted to stay in this same area on the south side of Chicago. In fact, this area will be called the Devil's Territory. That's what people called it. It was where a lot of gangsters were. You got to think, you had Chicago gangsters, you had brothels, you had saloons, you had really like the underbelly of society because people were displaced by the fire. A lot of people had fled Chicago at this time or fled to the suburbs, and whoever stayed in the city, they're just... It was a rough crowd. And so they moved to a bigger building, which had been called the Pacific Beer Garden. It was a huge saloon on the south side of Chicago. And so that's where they had moved to. And it was really in an area that was also called Whiskey Row. So there was this street that was full of nothing but brothels and saloons and gambling halls. And so this is where they set up their mission. In fact, they had some kind of a sign that was lit up, or a lantern. Later it would be a lit up sign, but which you got to remember, back then that was a novel idea. It would come to be known as the Old Lighthouse. A lot of people called it the Old Lighthouse. And so they set up right here on Whiskey Row, and they began to do these services. In fact, the garden had a building, but it also had like an actual garden area. And so oftentimes they would hold outdoor services. Remember, this is pre-air conditioning also. So when it was warm outside, they would hold these outdoor services as well. So one night in 1886, now, by the way, Sarah is kind of running this whole thing. Her husband would show up and preach. He was sort of handling the money and the books, but Sarah is the driving force behind all of this. Now remember, she had done the little Sunday school mission. God had spoken to her about decorating her house in heaven. This is really what she's called to do. And she's extremely involved every day. And so in 1886, there are a group of a few men who would frequent Whiskey Row, and among them was members of the Chicago White Stockings. Now later, this baseball club will be called the Chicago White Sox. So in this group is a young man who he's going to be with his friends. They had just won like a playoff game, and he's been playing for a couple of years with the White Stockings, and him and his friends are going out to have a good time. In fact, I read in one one article, that this group of friends had really been in some trouble because they had blown a game and lost out on a chance to win a pennant because they were all hungover from where they like to go to Whiskey Row all the time, and they were getting paid about $400 a month, which is a crazy amount of money at that time. And they were blowing their money on gambling, booze, and probably women. And so these guys are out to party. And while they're walking, they hear the people in the outdoor garden area of the Chicago Mission. And this one young man who's an outfielder hears... and he's also called the fastest man in baseball at this time in the major leagues. It says he outran the other guy by 10 yards that was, competing against him, and he'll kind of be known for that title for a few years. And so he hears the music, and it moves him so much. And I'm going to shift gears and talk about this guy for a minute. He hears the music, and it just moves him to tears. He stops. In fact, he tells his friends, you guys go ahead. I'm going to listen to this for a minute. So his friends go ahead, and he just stands there, and he just listens to these old hymns being sung by these people. And he's just so moved by their singing. Well, he comes back. It said here 4 or 5 nights in a row. He comes back to the mission, and he just begins to listen. And so one night, another man asked him if he would like to come in. And so he did. He said, yeah, I think I will. And so he comes in, and he listens to the testimonies, and he's very moved by the music. It reminds him of his childhood. And it says that, I'm going to read this part because it's so wonderful. So it says here that a voice that was like a breath from heaven aroused him. And he looked up into the face of Miss Sarah Clarke. And it says here that she had seen hundreds like him before, but tonight she talked to him like a mother. And she told him all about Jesus and about the free gift of salvation and the finished work of Christ. And she assured him, of salvation and about everything that Jesus had done. And he said that he gave his heart to the Lord, and he knew that his name had been written in the book of life, and that a peace that passeth all understanding came into his heart. Well, let me look at this story from both sides, because this famous baseball player, he has an interesting story that I just want to touch on. So he was born, I'm going to stop and just talk about him for a minute. So he was born in 1862. So he's a good bit younger than Sarah. His father was a Union soldier who served the Union Army out of Iowa, and he died of a disease 5 weeks after the birth of his youngest son. So when this guy was 10 years old, his mother was forced to send him and his older brother to the Soldiers' Orphans Home in Iowa. It was through this that him and his brother tried to stick together and everything through the orphanage, but he did love baseball, and so that was sort of his escape. He became very good at baseball, and in 1883, a man named A.G. Spalding president of the Chicago White Stockings. And by the way, Spalding is the same one of the baseball gloves and clothes that you can buy. You see it a lot of times on a baseball. Same guy. This man signed him to play because they were defending their National League championships. And so they signed him to play. In fact, while he was in the orphanage, he led his high school to the state championship. So he was quite an amazing baseball player. And so this guy will go on to be very famous and be very successful, big part of the team for the Chicago White Stockings. He was known to steal bases. He played center field. He played right field. He had a pretty decent batting average. And so he was just an all-around triple threat at baseball and had become really well known for people that followed baseball. And you got to remember, people were obsessed with baseball at this time. It was way more popular than football at this time. These guys were celebrities. So this man was named Billy Sunday. And Billy Sunday will go on to be an evangelist. In fact, Billy Sunday would go on to preach with the YMCA, and then he would go out on his own as an evangelist. And he, at one time, preached to over 300,000 people was the estimate. Now, this is pre-television, pre-internet. This is just newspapers, just print media being able to tell you about what he had done. But he goes on to have an amazing ministry. Sarah, I'm going to go back to her, and then I'm going to talk about Billy Sunday again. Sarah in 1910 will start a Pacific Garden Mission home for girls, for orphan girls. And then in 1918, Sarah will pass away. Now, I do want to read this. This was from her obituary in the Chicago Daily Tribune. It says, for 30 years, she conversed with every man in the Cook County Jail who had been condemned for murder. She never missed a night at the mission for 6,000 nights. She sold her jewels, gave up wearing rich clothing, gave up a luxurious home, and gave up her life for others. Wow. In fact, people said had she been born in an earlier time, she would be up for sainthood. And so she has an amazing testimony. And so I'm going to switch gears and talk about Billy Sunday and her spiritual DNA, her spiritual inheritance in Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday will go on to be an evangelist. He was sort of pioneered being a wild evangelist. He was a little unorthodox. In fact, he made a lot of people very uncomfortable with his style of preaching. And he will go on, like I said, to work with the YMCA. And then he will meet a man called D.L. Moody, and he will go on to work under an evangelist that Moody had trained named Wilbur Chapman. And by the way, when I say D.L. Moody, he will pioneer the Moody Bible Institute that you may be familiar with. And so there is a man named Wilbur Chapman that was also an evangelist, and he pioneered sort of what we would call mass evangelism, like where they would have tent meetings or they would have, large congregations, maybe at a civic center or an outdoor park. And so he really pioneered that movement. He was actually a Presbyterian minister who had worked with D.L. Moody. And so he pioneers mass evangelism. And this man, Wilbur Chapman, will hire Billy Sunday to be basically his apprentice. He will go and have him go out ahead and, procure a location, set up everything for ministry to assist him. And then he actually hires another man to apprentice with him whose name is Mordecai Ham. So Mordecai Ham and Billy Sunday are both sort of the proteges of Wilbur Chapman. And they're all sort of pioneering this idea of mass evangelism, which really never been done before. You would have old school camp meetings, but where, an evangelist would go to a field in a farming agriculture area. But as cities were becoming more popular and people were moving out to into cities from the countryside, now that we're sort of at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they're pioneering this new form of evangelism that was kind of patterned off the camp meeting style, but a little different because you're in cities. And so they tour In fact, they'll tour all over the world. Wilbur Chapman did. He would go all over the world. And Billy Sunday would take over his ministry when he passed away. When he passes away. And so Mordecai Ham also goes on to have his own ministry doing evangelism. Mordecai Ham, in around 1934, will go and have a preaching, meeting in North Carolina. And there, at the urging of a Sunday school director, a young man will come to his meeting. And that young man will give his heart to the Lord at Mordecai Ham's meeting. He will go on to be an evangelist in the pattern of both Billy Sunday and Mordecai Ham. And his name is Billy Graham. And so Billy Graham will have a connection to these two men evangelists. And we know that Billy Sunday was led to the Lord through Sarah Dunn Clarke at the Pacific Garden Mission. Originally it was called the Pacific Beer Garden Mission. It was actually Dale Moody who said, you should probably drop the word beer from the name. Good idea. And so Billy Graham has a spiritual DNA connection to the Pacific Garden Mission and to Sarah Dunn Clarke and the pioneering work that they've done at this mission. And so Billy Graham, in 2008, they estimated that his audience, that he had reached 2.2 billion people, and that's now estimated to be 3 to 4 billion. They really don't know. With the dawn of the internet, and there's just no way to know how many people Billy Graham has reached for the gospel. And I would even say that his impact is amazing. It's right up there with the Apostle Paul, just the impact that he's had on the world with the message and the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so it's amazing. And so we just see this connection, this thread of spiritual DNA to this one woman who was just obedient. She was obedient to the Lord. And right there in Civil War era America, in New York City, she's decorating her parents' house, and the Lord just speaks to her audibly and ask her, what are you doing to decorate your home in heaven? And so it sent her on a journey, and it definitely had an impact on Billy Graham. We know that Billy Graham mentored under Billy Sunday, and he'll adopt his style of preaching and mass evangelism. And so it's just amazing to me about spiritual DNA and how that just one word from the Lord prophetically speaking to you, can have a domino effect, and we still don't know how many salvations are credited to the account of Sarah Dunn Clarke. The stock that she has in both Billy Sunday and Billy Graham is still ongoing. That stock is still growing and splitting. And so it's amazing. $1 of Coca-Cola stock, what would that be worth today? I found an article that says if you bought Coca-Cola, one share of stock in 1919, when it went public over 100 years ago, which would have been valued at about $40 back in 1919, one share would be worth $40. Today, that would be worth about $10 million. And so the same logic applies to the kingdom of heaven. Sarah Dunn Clarke has stock in so many ministries that are still thriving, going forward, and making disciples and pioneers right behind them in the same spiritual DNA. And so it's like her buying $1 share in Billy Graham, $1 share in Billy Sunday. And what's that worth today in the kingdom of heaven? Well, according to this, if we're using Coca-Cola as a guide, it's worth about $10 million. Amazing. And so God's economy, the economy of the kingdom of heaven, is exponential. And I believe the same applies to spiritual DNA. So next time you hear a voice from the Lord and you're obedient to that voice, it can have amazing dividends in the kingdom of heaven. I hope you enjoyed this Prophetic History podcast. Have a blessed day. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Please be sure to hit the subscribe button so you'll be informed next time I post. Thank you again, and have a blessed day.